left and went somewhere before the war? Because I think it's mentioned in the film she survived. I was just wondering what form of contact he had with his mother after the war and what happened to her.
Who?
Otto's mother?
Otto's brother? Mother. Yes. His sister, because her husband got a job in Switzerland in 1929. So the sister with her two sons, one of them, Buddy Elias, is the only survivor of that family now. She went to live in Basel with Otto's mother. She moved because she was an elderly lady. She moved. And she died in the 50s. So that is why Otto and my mother, when they got married, they went to live in the same house where his sister lived, and the mother still lived there. They lived there on the top in a little attic. They stayed there for many, many years, but then later they got their own house, but still in Basel. And Otto was 91 years old when he died in 1980. He was 17 years older than my mother, but the age difference really didn't matter at all.
Could you talk a little about your relationship with Otto?
Yes. I came to England for a year to study photography, and there I met my husband, who had come from Israel to study economics, and we lived in Cricklewood in a little boarding house, and after about 6 months, he asked me to marry him. We had fallen in love, and I said, no way can I get married and go with you anywhere, because I have to go back to Amsterdam to be with my mother. And then Otto Frank, who was very much involved in the liberal Jewish organization here with Lady Montague, and so he came over quite often to conferences because he formed a liberal Jewish synagogue in Amsterdam. And so I told him that, and he said, well, your mother and me have fallen in love as well, and when you are settled, we like to get married as well. So this is what happened. We got married in 1952, and they got married in 1953. I was, of course, very happy that my mother found somebody with whom she would have a life again. But, you know, I adored my father as well, and very often seeing my mother so extremely happy was as well painful for me. And one day I asked her, I can't understand, how can you be so happy with another man who is not the father of your children and with whom you have been so happy? And she said, well, your father was a completely different person than Otto. I was young, she was 18 when she got married, my father was 21. We had a very exciting life. He was the boss. He always came up with new things, and he was very sporty, and he was one of the first people who bought a car, and in Austria he went up the mountains, mountain roads, and I sat in the back screaming, but life was very exciting. With Otto, it's now that I'm older, but she was 45 when she married him, so, but she thought it was already older. No, 47 actually. And I know exactly what is happening. We talk about everything, and it's just ideal. You know, when I was young, I had this exciting husband. Now that I'm older, I've got a husband. I know exactly what we are going to do. We discuss everything together. It was really an ideal situation. So I understood that, but it was nevertheless sometimes a little painful for me. But as he was such a wonderful person, I didn't really resent him. And again, like I said, he was such a wonderful grandfather, and my children didn't have another grandfather. The father of my husband had died in Israel in 1948, so he was the only grandfather. But like you have seen from my youngest daughter, she found it difficult because it was her grandfather, and there he always talks about somebody who that didn't really mean anything to her. So, you know, there was, when she gave the interview, she said, Was I right to say that? Because everybody always said how wonderful, everything positive, and I really say something negative. I said, well, you were his grandchild. You had a different relation to him than all those strangers in a way. For them it was a father figure, but it wasn't really their father. But for you, it was your grandfather. So there are many, many conflicting feelings, even with Otto. When he looked at me sometimes, I was sometimes wondering, is he thinking, because I was exactly the same age as Anne, why did she survive and not my own daughter? He never said that, but I had this feeling, perhaps he thinks that. And I certainly thought my father, he was much younger than Otto, much more physical, very physical person, very strong. I thought, well, why did my father not survive? And you, being a much older man, why did you survive? So, you know, sometimes it was difficult, but nevertheless, I loved him dearly.
Did you say you were also in hiding?
Pardon?
Did you say you were also in hiding?
Oh, yes. Well, my story is very much parallel to the French story, only we came in Holland in 1940, in February 1940, so much later. And in 1942, many, many teenagers, so between 16 and 26 perhaps, got call-up notices to be deported to Germany to a work camp. And that is when my brother got this call-up notice, and Anne's sister Margot, and many, many other young people. But this is when we went into hiding, and our parents didn't send the young people. But many parents, especially the Dutch parents, who hadn't yet experienced the terrible things the Nazis were able to do. And they thought, and it did say a work camp in Germany, so they thought, well, they probably need people to work in the factories, but they were actually all sent to Mauthausen and just thrown down from the cliffs. We only heard that, of course, after the war. And there's a big monument in Mauthausen for the first Dutch young people who were murdered by the Nazis. But we were 2 years in hiding. We were betrayed, similar story, earlier actually in May 1944 and sent to Auschwitz. The Franks were betrayed in 1944, but in August. And then, of course, we were still a month in Westerbork in the holding camp, and that's why France and Belgium were already freed, that me, for instance, really believed Anne would return within a few months, the war would end soon. But the war dragged on much longer than everybody expected at the time.